All right, we're recording, so I'm going to start it off. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the bi-weekly Tech Interchange meeting. Michelle just joined as well. Hi, Michelle. We have a couple things on the agenda. I would like, before we start with that, to see if there's anybody that's new, any new faces. Hey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sorry?
Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, where you're working, what you do, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, hey, I'm Thomas. I mainly use OpenWhisk for my master's thesis right now, and yeah, I just thought I'd join and check this out, but nothing special besides from that, I guess.
Well, thank you so much for joining, and we really appreciate having you here.
Thanks.
So apart from that, I think we're going to go through to James, who's going to talk a little bit about the pluggable event provider. James, can you kick us off?
Yeah, can I, let me share my screen. I've got a couple of slides to run through.
Sure.
Let's just try this. Right, so if I do that, I'm going to share. I'll go to Keynote. And I click play. Can you see my slides now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is James Thomas. I'm a developer advocate at IBM. For those that don't know me, I'm also an OpenWhisk committer on the project management committee and just general serverless fanboy, right? I just love serverless and OpenWhisk. And I have been doing some kind of experiment. So I started doing a kind of experiment before Christmas with building a new event provider for OpenWhisk for an internal project. And I decided to build it in a slightly different way. And I thought it was kind of interesting and maybe fix some of the problems that we have. So I thought I would come and kind of share what I'd done to see if the community thought this was interesting and contribute it. And just think about some of the stuff I discovered. So, if we think about OpenWhisk in terms of event sources, right, and our comparison to some of the other platforms, we have that most of the bases covered, right? Most of the core event services in there, right? Things like an API gateway, an Apache Kafka and CouchDB and Cron and GitHub and Alarm and things like that, which covers most of the core event sources that most people expect from a FaaS platform. But what I thought was kind of interesting is that most of these event sources were kind of contributed fairly early in OpenWhisk kind of project time, and we haven't had like a lot of recent contributions. So most of those came in when OpenWhisk was kind of created early days, and obviously very well used by the community. But serverless is all about the event sources, I think anyway. And so I've always kind of wondered why we don't have more, right? If you look at, say, runtime support, we've had great contributions from lots of contributors to add things like PHP and Ruby and other things, and people have really jumped on that, and we've all benefited from that. But people don't seem to really code event providers and give them back to the community, right? So I was kind of thinking about why this might be. And it turns out that I think there's a couple of reasons. As I was kind of investigating writing trigger feeds and kind of looking at the code, I'm just doing so. Okay, trigger feeds do the code. I think they're not super simple to implement. There's actually quite a lot of kind of boilerplate code around trigger management that is in there. If you look at the existing feed providers, it's kind of quite hard to understand. And as usual, documentation is not super great on this stuff. So you end up having to spend a lot of time just reading the code to really understand how it works. And I think this is kind of one of the reasons maybe that people don't contribute so much. It's not super simple, and the doc's not great, because actually this is something, you don't need to know Scala to actually contribute a feed provider, which is something that I can actually do, right? So in theory, it should be easy for people to do this stuff, but we don't seem to get many contributions. So the background to this is that kind of before Christmas, I was asked to produce for a kind of internal project an S3 compatible feed provider. So this is going to use a very simple algorithm of just polling a bucket, looking at the E tags on the files, kind of storing them in a Redis cache, and using that as a way to poll S3, basically to provide a kind of S3 trigger feed for an internal project with kind of OpenWhisk. And so I started to obviously this time dig into how feed providers worked and think about a little bit about like how they worked and things like that. Someone is chatting. What's this? Chat. Let's have a look. Oh, right, cool. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, right. So S3 is a generic API now, right? It's not just AWS. It's, yeah, this seems to be the generic provider for all feeds and things like that. So for those of you, to give some background, right, who are not maybe familiar with how trigger feeds work in OpenWhisk, it's slightly opaque, right? Although it's actually really, really simple under the covers. It kind of works like this, right? If you're familiar with when you're creating a trigger feed, you create a trigger using the CLI, and you have this feed parameter, right? And actually, this feed parameter, it gives you an identifier for essentially what is a normal action within the system. So when you're creating the trigger, what happens is the CLI goes and talks to the platform API, it creates the trigger, and then it calls the feed action that you passed in with the parameter with those event parameters. That's all that kind of happens under the covers, right? And to expose event sources, you need to create one of these feed providers, as well as the kind of provider backend. And the docs around this, again, it's kind of sort of documented, but it's a little bit scant. But essentially, that custom feed provider action has to deal with a kind of life cycle event, right? The CLI says, you know, create a new trigger feed, get rid of it, pause it, all this kind of stuff. And what your event provider gets passed is the identifier for the trigger name, and then the credentials to be able to call it. And it's up to the provider backend to listen to the external event source. And then when those external events occur, it has to call the trigger in OpenWhisk with those event parameters, right? Everything's kind of pushed into the provider to be able to maintain. It's fairly lightweight integration. And if you look at most of the existing feed providers, things like Cloud and Kafka, most of them have this kind of architecture. They're actually mostly copy and pasted code from one was like the original one, and then people copy and pasted that code. You have a lot of the same code in pretty much all of the project repositories. And it looks kind of, this is the architecture of how it kind of looks. So you have the CLI, which talks to that feed action, again, just by calling it, invoking it with the lifecycle parameters. To tell me later on. What happens then is that for most of the event providers, they have a feed action that then just talks to, just kind of proxies that event to a web action, which installed kind of privately. And what this web action does is basically just, it maintains the trigger lifecycle, the trigger details, by just writing to CouchDB. So it has a CouchDB instance that just keeps all of the trigger details that have been registered with that event provider. And then in the back end, it has a Docker container that gets spun up and run as part of OpenWhisk as well, right, as part of the feed provider package. And that Docker container essentially just has some Node.js code that listens to that cloud and database. It just follows it, just use the follow capability to listen to changes for that database. And whenever new triggers get written, it's responsible for reading the event provider credentials, talking to that event provider, setting up the kind of event source listening, and then whenever it happens, whenever events occur, that provider gets obviously recognizes that, you know, it's listening to those events, and it can use those trigger details it gets passed during the registration to invoke OpenWhisk, right? To invoke the trigger in OpenWhisk, and that's how your trigger gets called, basically. So you have these couple of actions, then you have your kind of custom event provider. And if you go and look at things like the Kafka one, the Cloud one, the Cron one, they all use this kind of architecture. And again, most of the code seems to be copy and pasted, even though it's in separate kind of repos. So when I was trying to understand this and see how it worked, I was kind of reading through the code and working out how things work. What I realized is that most of the code is just kind of boilerplate, copy and pasted around trigger management, right? So it's not specific to that event source, so it's Kafka or CouchDB, right? It's around this trigger management stuff, and then managing the database and passing lifecycle events back and forth. And therefore, most of the code between different providers is just copy and pasted, right? Which is kind of difficult to maintain and get outdated and doesn't get refactored and this kind of stuff. So when I was going to build a new event provider, I thought, well, hold on, rather than me, again, just like forking a repo and just trying to, you know, change a little bit, why don't I try and build some kind of generic event provider where we could take 90% of the code, kind of wrap it up in a kind of generic provider interface, and then just have a kind of plug-in architecture where you can write a tiny bit of code with a little interface which manages talking to your custom event source. And let's do this, since I'm already going to go and have to do this work of creating a new event provider. And the benefits I thought of this would be that it was easier to, if we had this, right, people could contribute new event sources really easily with just a bit of JavaScript, so not having to worry about this whole trigger management piece of it. And in theory, if we had lots of event sources that use this generic provider, it would be easier to maintain that in the open source community, right? If you look at the existing event providers, yeah, there's a lot of redundant copy and pasted code, and that means when we come to maintenance, people have to remember to update both multiple repos, and the code has obviously grown fairly organically and it's not been refactored for a while and things like that. And I think that's due to having these kind of redundant code bases all over the place. So this is what I kind of did, right, to overcall Christmas when I was building my S3 event source. And this is the kind of architecture I was kind of looking for. I wanted to take all those things in the gray blob and make them a kind of generic provider, and then have a little custom interface. You could just write an interface in your node module and implement certain methods, and then npm install that, and then the provider would just kind of work out of the gate. And so I spent a kind of month working on this before Christmas, and actually I got it working. So I started with a cloud and event provider, and I wanted to just do as little changes as possible to the existing code base, but just add in a kind of plug point so that it took advantage of all of the kind of scalability and load balancing stuff that was already built in there and has been used over years. And I made this, which is essentially just that cloud provider with a little bits ripped out and refactored, and then some plugin endpoints. And how it works is your plugin is just a Node.js module that you need to publish on npm. And then just it has this kind of very, very simple interface, right? So your plugin gets instantiated when that provider container gets ran dynamically when it starts up. And it has two methods that it has to implement that gets called by the provider, which is add and remove. So whenever a trigger gets added with the details, your provider gets called, and you can set up, connecting to that external event source and all that kind of stuff. And then obviously remove when you need to stop listening. And then to be able to fire triggers within the system, you get passed in the trigger manager instance during initialization, which just has these two methods, right? Fire trigger and disable trigger. So again, rather than the trigger plugin OpenWhisk instance, how do you actually fire triggers? What about retries? Because there's a lot of logic around retries and stuff that is important to do. I just kind of had a little interface, exposed a little interface that would allow you to do that very, very easily and at a high level without having to get into the details. Again, kind of minimizing how much code you would have to put in that kind of plugin interface. Yeah, and in terms of running it, it then becomes super simple, right? You just kind of, you get the existing repo, the generic provider, you npm install your module and use an environment variable to pass in the module name. It gets dynamically instantiated, and then you just start the provider, and it just registers your code and then starts to listen to the database. And it uses all of the existing environment variables and stuff that the existing event providers do. So I just took the existing stuff, so minimal kind of changes, and it gives you the generic feed provider actions that you can then install to expose this to users. And once I finished this code, I then actually went and wrote my S3 kind of polling feed provider interface. So again, it just uses polling with S3 buckets, and it uses Redis to cache the E tags and then compares them between polls. And it's just very kind of relatively simple way to check file changes from any S3 compatible object store. And it actually works super well. I had it running over Christmas, and it's been running for about a month, and both the provider and it just works perfectly. So this is really, really nice, and gives you the little events down the bottom. And I know an object store is obviously something that people have been asking for a while. So it's just kind of to fill a gap like this. But the most interesting thing about the S3 event provider is actually how little code it required me to write. So with about 300 lines of JavaScript, I implemented this S3 event source. And that includes, most of that's just like talking to Redis, storing the stuff, all of this kind of stuff, right? It's just kind of polling on a timer and storing the cache in Redis and then comparing. And this is actually a tiny amount of code compared to the amount of code that the generic feed provider has, and that you would have to maintain if you wrote one of these from scratch, even if you kind of copying and pasting. And I actually thought this was this went really, really well for me, and it's made me think about being able to now write other event providers using this generic provider interface, because I think I've had ideas for a while about different event providers I want to implement, but having to go through that whole process of maintaining a whole individual feed provider just for a tiny bit of code has seemed like a lot of work. So I kind of brought it to the table today, or to this call, to kind of just obviously share it with the community and see what people think, and then maybe talk about, based on feedback, some of next steps for this. At the moment, it's just a private repository internally at work, but I can just open source this to begin with. I can put it on GitHub and I can write a blog post. The documentation's already well there in the repo and things like that for people to get started. And that would probably be my first step, is let's just open source it and talk about it and see if people find this useful. Then potentially I or others, could think about writing some more event provider plugins, since it's so easy. So like RabbitMQ is one, ActiveMQ. People ask for a lot, on a couple of other services. So you could start to build up a greater library of those and kind of actually start to use it. And then I think if actually people began to use this in their OpenWhisk deployments, are interested in doing that and found this useful, I could actually look at contributing it back to Apache officially and have this become part of the official project. So I thought I would share and see what you think. I can't actually see the chat window, so I'll have a look in a minute. But yeah, if this is interesting to you, or you think this is bad, tell me. Let's have a discussion and we can talk about it, and I can work on getting you the code. I can work on open sourcing it fairly quickly and getting you the code to kind of play around with it.
Thank you so much, James. There was lots of excitement in the chat window, so
Okay.
definitely good stuff there. We also had 2 new people come in, Upcar and Nathan. Welcome. Does anybody have any feedback for James? I thought it was really cool. I want to know what everybody else thinks.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me, but my earpods now died, so I have to use the normal mic. I think it's really exciting, and I think we should look at it just to bring down the maintenance of the provider down. Maybe just also look into maybe reworking the existing ones on common ground. So it's really cool.
Yeah, I think this is great. This is what we wanted to do from day one. Steven Fink, actually, when he did the providers and the documentation, we wanted a common library that was boilerplate. What we have there, it can be added to Apache as a GitHub repo, and also an npm package. The next things will be like if somebody wants to take the current providers for Kafka, Cloud, and Alarms, and just eliminate all the duplication code and just require this package, because it's a lot of technical depth. I'm excited to see people creating new providers very easily. With a few lines of code, you can build something like watching the log files for databases and SQL, which a lot of people are asking for, and like Minio or S3. So I think Radek is also, I don't know if you're going to say something, but he said that looks positive. But the background story was the Cloud and Alarm. 2 people were working on it separately, and they just duplicated code. They never had the chance to come together and merge it into what you have here, but that's exactly what we wanted. That's my 2 cents.
In the chat, Roderick is also saying, this is great, James. Definitely would love to see this in Apache OpenWhisk. I think you did a good job. Thank you so much for that, James. We're really looking forward to, well, I'm looking forward to seeing it in the project as well. Right, Carlos, you already talking a little bit. Would you mind continuing and actually chatting about the incubator release checklist?
Yeah, this is a checklist which is every TLP project, or I guess incubator project does when they do releases and check releases, artifacts, and Justin from the IPMC kind of like have he's great reviewing and doing releases and voting. So he jot down like a nice checklist of what are the things that he does. And he put it down into a checklist. I thought it was very useful, and he shared it with all the incubator projects as a guideline. And I think it was a good thing. So I shared it to the dev leads to see what they think. Some of the steps could be automated. Like we can add, like if you clone the repo or download the zip file, run this command, and that will validate certain things. Right now, I think, and those checklists is for everyone. It could be a committer, it could be a PMC member, or it could be a contributor. The idea is like that verification is because sometimes artifacts used to be done like manually, like people signed them manually, created a zip file manually. But Vincent, he did a lot of automation. So mainly we'll be checking like if something changed in automation and something didn't get corrected. But if like licenses and new things are not added, it becomes very fast to go over like the checklist. I think Chaz from Adobe suggested to make it a template in the release repo. So when we're going to like create a repo or a template that we can check boxes, like all these things are covered in this release to streamline the process. So because some people don't know what to check. Like we do a voting and then people do +1, and we ask like they're doing +1 because they think it's a good idea, or they actually check the artifact and download in their laptop. So you actually, if you're going to vote, like you need to verify and not just like, oh, this sounds like a good idea. You're voting because you're helping out, like check out we did an error or a typo or something, right? That's my 2 cents. I don't want to take more time on that.
And Dave, you actually had something about this as well. Would you like to comment on this as well?
Yeah, I guess there was an email thread a couple of weeks ago, I guess, kicked off about trying to get our next actually get a consolidated release out of OpenWhisk. Just I guess the topic here was just to try to 2 topics. One, so the checklist can be helpful. And then the second thing is just trying to figure out how we actually organize towards that. I think we have 21, 22 Git repos or something like that need to get released as part of our coordinated release. And I'm not sure we actually have a view on like whether we're ready to start, whether there are things that still have to get done, and how to stage all that. And it does get challenging. It's probably more of a devilish discussion, but maybe there's some way we can think about if we can stage this with a proper set of branches so that maybe we can, initially I was thinking we would need sort of 3 rounds of release voting, sort of starting at the bottom, getting the runtimes ready in the CLI, and then you get a release of the core system that bakes in those versions in the Docker images, and then you release that, and then you go up to the OpenWhisk, to the Helm charts and things on top, the dev tools that deploy on top of that. Maybe we can set up the branches and kind of push it out with one set of voting. Maybe we can even try to do a consolidated tar file. I don't know. Asking people to +1, they've checked the MD5 hash sums on 22 tar files seems tedious at best.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess the topic there is just to how do we proceed.
Yeah, the 3 waves sounds good. So I think there's like that we don't have to answer what is the process. The process is there. Is open an email that says discuss. First wave, take the runtimes, create the TGCs, ask people to vote. Well, the discuss is like, are people ready, or do they have an objection to cut what is in master right now? And then if they're not, then just do the first wave and the first release with the first email and send out the 11 TGCs. It's just a matter of like, who's going to do it, who wants to volunteer to do it in this wave or that wave, and then someone takes the same person, another person takes the second wave. So the process is there, the how-to is there. It's just someone putting hours and sitting down and just doing it. I think that's the question. And branches are okay, and the order of the waves is okay. So I don't see any problems with what you're suggesting, Dave.
Okay.
But I don't see anything else. Am I missing something, or like?
No, I guess it's just mostly just how do we decide as a community that we're actually ready? And I guess should we send mail?
It's discuss. That's the how.
Yep.
And there's lazy consensus. If nobody answers that question, you move forward to the voting. That's the Apache way.
All right.
It's not more complex than that. There's no like hugging or it's just and we do a release this week and we do a release next week and we do a next release. I know it's a lot of files, but then we find the right balance, right? But it's been a while since I've done a release, so I think it's time.
I like that lazy consensus. If nobody objects, then that must mean it's okay.
Yeah, that's the Apache way. You have to give 20. Yeah, that's the 72 hours to give everyone around the world, time zone wise, and maybe a day or something. They missed the email, right? It's like, oh wait, I have something critical that needs to go to master, and then we say like, can you wait for the next release? Can you wait until next week, or do you actually need to, put it in, cherry pick it into the branch? That's the discussion. That's the discuss.
Okay, before we go on to Roderick, who has a bunch of things, I'd like to see if there's anybody else that wants to share anything. Maybe any updates on core or Kubernetes updates, tooling updates, anything like that. You're more than welcome to share.
I'll just chime in on the release, on the graduation stuff, though. So I just know that IBM Legal has prepared draft documents and exchanging them with Apache board, legal team there. So my hope, and I have a checkpoint tomorrow with our legal team to see how it's going. But if the drafts are approved by both sides, then we're hoping to have them signed by the board for the trademark handoff, which is this last significant thing. I think after we get this combined release and get the trademarks handed off, then we can move towards graduation and initiate that process. So Apache board meetings the 20th. We're hoping to get them signed there. They have to be reviewed and signed at a board meeting. If we miss the 20th, we have to wait till March.
That's exciting, Matt. Really cool. Thank you so much. Before we go to Roderick, can I already have a volunteer for next bi-weekly meeting? It's meeting that's in 2 weeks. Exactly same time, same place. All you have to do is really kind of like wrangle some people together. James, you already have your hand up. If you'd like to do it, that would be awesome. Thank you so much, James. That's great. Okay, before we go to Roderick, anybody else have anything that they would like to contribute or add or talk about?
Shall I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So mine are just a bunch of housekeeping issues. I created just a few minutes ago issues on OpenWhisk for addressing these. They are, I guess, four items. One, I sent a dev list email to remove some playbooks we have in the system that were contributed some time ago for distributed OpenWhisk deployment on OpenStack. These were done in a way where you can set up the VMs and then deploy. Some people have tried to use these over time on AWS and others, and I think they may have been successful. But there are several issues open and a couple of pull requests recently from people trying them and encountering a number of issues. I tried them over the weekend and sort of just sanity checked some of the remaining code, and there's a bit of rot in there, as one might expect, since these have not been tested or supported. And I think officially these have not really been maintained. So my first item is basically I opened a pull request to remove these and documented how you should do a distributed deployment. If you're using the Ansible playbooks, there's a way, and if you're on Kubernetes, then it's a completely separate model. And of course, others have their own for Mesos and DCOS. So that's the first one. So if you care about this, please comment on the dev list or on the pull request that I opened earlier today. One of the things I noticed in that playbook is the ability to deploy CouchDB with a persisted store, where you have a file system mount for your database on the host. I thought that was a nice feature, and look through our documentation. We don't actually document how to have a persisted CouchDB. We sort of punt and say install CouchDB on your host. I tried doing that. It's actually a little tricky, especially on newer Ubuntu distributions. So running Couch inside a container like we do today essentially is a solved problem, but we should just mount a file system to persist the database. So I looked into how to do that. I opened an issue as a feature request to do that. It's not that complicated, and I already did it, so I might open a pull request for that too. So this is a solicitation for feedback. Third is the ability to serve some static HTML out of our Nginx. So today when you deploy OpenWhisk and you go to the API host, you get a JSON response which says, here are the runtimes that are available. And what would be nice instead is maybe having a nice landing page that says, welcome to OpenWhisk, here are some pointers to documentation, here are some tutorials, here's maybe how you create a function, a walkthrough. There's some work that has been happening at IBM as part of the, what was formerly called the shell is now called KUI. That might be interesting to integrate at some point. So what I want to do is basically add the ability within Nginx to serve static content. And this would be something that we just mount inside the Nginx container and say anything in this directory just gets served as static content. And maybe we can provide, just a simple hello world kind of tutorial. The inspiration for this is sort of looking at some of the other open source FAS projects out there, in particular, things like OpenFAS do a really good job of sort of onboarding their users with a nice UI, sort of very intuitive, and we could do something simple like that. One of the reasons we hadn't done that is because we've sort of felt any operator of such a platform will build their own or integrate with their own system for a UI and experience. But I think given the state of where things are, this might not be a bad thing to have and doesn't actually cost us a lot to do. The last is maybe a bit of cleanup on our runtimes. So looking through our runtimes and how many we have, particularly for things like Swift and PHP and Node and Python. I opened an issue for this to solicit discussion, but I think we can remove maybe some of the older runtimes. Because of the ability today where a deployment can provide its own runtimes manifest and says, here are runtimes available. Those runtimes are discoverable for somebody who's using that deployment. I think from the Apache OpenWhisk perspective, maybe cutting down on some of these things to reduce the deployment time and the total amount of space that such a deployment takes, because it has to pull a bunch of Swift images, for example, which are all pretty big. And it's like all the Swift images together take like 2 gigabytes, a little bit more actually. So yes, we should do some housekeeping on our images, and maybe there's ways of reducing the image size for any particular runtime, but I don't think we need some of the older deprecated Swift runtimes. So Swift 2, Swift 3.1, maybe even Swift 4. I think there's a new Swift version that was just announced yesterday. So maybe sort of the Apache OpenWhisk runtime manifest is just simpler and cleaner and has, 2 versions of Node, maybe 2 versions of Python, just because Python 2.7 is still popular, and then just the latest version of, say, PHP and Swift and whatever else that we have. So I opened issues for this as well, soliciting feedback, and I can open pull requests for some of these as well. That's it. I just wanted to share that with the community.
Yeah, the default deployment on Ansible does the pooling of the images. So yeah, you don't have all that data already cached. It takes a while. So I'm okay by having the default, just having the latest version, and then having some exceptions, like you said, the Python, have the Python 2 and the Python 3. But the other one's just the latest version. I don't think why we need to have 2 versions of Node. I think everybody should move to Node.js 10 because Node.js 6 is end of line April, and Node.js 8 is in October or something. But Node.js 10 can do anything that Node.js 8 can do. But yeah, we can discuss it more. But yeah, I agree. Too many images and somebody getting started, downloading all that takes a lot of time. The Docker Compose doesn't download everything, but it has one task that it can download everything. Don't know about Kubernetes. It might be downloading everything or maybe not. But yeah, house cleanup is good. Always good.
Right. I mean, I think there is a more there is a second process to this, which is, instead of Ansible or Kubernetes at deploy time pull the images, the invoker should just be in charge of doing this, and they could do it as needed.
On demand, yeah.
On demand, or maybe with a little bit of speculation, basically just using spare cycles. And so that reduces also the initial boot time as well. The system is live and it's doing a little bit of prefetching. But that's a bit more work, because now we have to move some of that capability into the invoker. Not hard again, but removing the runtimes is easier, and I think gets you a bit of user experience, initial user experience goodness that is good for us.
Right. With the kube deploy, it's getting pulled in a separate container right now. That's happening as an init container, but that could just run as a job scattered across the nodes too. I mean, and we could probably actually do that in a Ansible-based deploy if we wanted to, is to run the
Async.
Run a separate job asynchronously to pull. It doesn't have to go in the invoker.
I like it. Yeah, good idea. Yeah, I like the web page, static web page of just rendering what is available, what is the build, and then maybe start with a snippet of get the CLI and run this snippet of code for your first function. Kind of a experience. Like some people may get lost. They deploy OpenWhisk, what's the next step?
Yeah, that makes sense, and it also gives us an opportunity to link back to documentation and to the Slack channel and stuff like that, so that if someone gets lost, we can do a little bit more hand-holding. I think it makes sense, definitely. Especially for people trying things out on their local machine and stuff like that. Having these dashboards really adds to the user experience. I agree. All right, does anybody have anything else they would like to add? Anything that came into their mind and they have to share with us? If not, then I'm going to end this bi-weekly meeting. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube right now, because we are recording this, you can join us. This meeting is every 2 weeks. The next meeting is going to be on the 20th of February. That's 11 a.m. Eastern US time, 5 p.m. Central Europe time, 4 p.m. UTC, and 12 a.m. Beijing time. Please join us. James Thomas is going to be the amazing moderator that week. Thank you so much for being here, and looking forward to seeing what updates there are to OpenWhisk in 2 weeks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Justin. Bye.
Bye.